Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mrs. Watkins, and I am going to go over this presentation with you. We're going to be looking today at effects of the Great Depression. So, in a previous session, in a previous recording, you already looked at causes of the Great Depression. So, what we're focusing on are what were some of the effects or some of the results. So, remember that on October 24th, the stock market had begun to decline, okay? And it continued. This was a Thursday. By the next Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, the stock market actually crashed. You see right here. And this was known as Black Tuesday. As the stock market crashed, prices dropped. People couldn't pay back their loans. They were frantically trying to sell their stock, which continued to drive the prices down. So what were some effects of this crash? Well, banks that had made bad loans on risky stocks, they began to lose money. People panicked when they saw the banks losing money, and people started taking their own money out of the banks, which further caused problems for the banks and caused many banks to have to close. When large numbers of people would go to the bank and withdraw their money, these were called bank runs. Many of these bank runs forced the banks to close their doors. When a bank closed its doors, the people who had money deposited there lost it. All right? So if your money was in the bank and it crashed, it closed its doors, you had lost your deposit. So let's remember that although the stock market crash did not cause the Great Depression, it definitely made it worse. And we can see from just this description here how that took place. As more banks closed, so did more businesses. As businesses closed, people lost their jobs. As they lost their jobs, they might lose their homes and their farms. There was a decrease in the demand for goods because people didn't have money to buy things, which caused more businesses to fail, which caused more people to be out of jobs. It just continued a big cycle. Well, President Herbert Hoover was our president at this time, and he was one of many people who thought this was just part of the boom and bust business cycle. He thought it would pass quickly. He reacted with caution because he believed in this word right here, laissez-faire. We've seen this word before. Laissez-faire economy and laissez-faire government means that the federal government keeps their hands off of things, all right? They don't get too involved. And so he called on churches and state and local governments, charitable organizations, and private citizens to try to help the needy. He worked with businesses to make more credit available and to get railroads and local governments to start projects to employ people, but he did fear that government intervention could reduce an incentive to work and that it might undermine the idea of rugged individualism, the idea that individuals worked hard and that's what had made America great. So that was his philosophy. That was a belief that he had that led him to react in this way. Well, our Great Depression was really part of a worldwide depression. You can see these other countries over here. You see the U.S., you see Sweden, Norway, Netherlands, Germany, and so on. You can see that this was the number of people that were unemployed, industrial workers unemployed in 1933 worldwide. President Hoover suggested a year-long pause in the payment of debts to World War I. Other banks in England began to fail. Governments tried to raise interest on loans, but that didn't work. And so the Depression spread and deepened worldwide. The human toll of the Depression. These pictures really help us see what it was like for people, how it affected the average everyday person. Millions of Americans were unemployed and were destitute or extremely poor. Many lost their homes. There was no government safety net like we have now. There was no unemployment, for example, that you could apply for. Soup kitchens like this right here and bread lines appeared across the nation. Churches and charities did what they could to help people, but hundreds of thousands of people were living on the streets. Look at this. These men here. You notice it's all men here, and you see in the picture you see free soup, and then up here you see coffee and donuts for the unemployed. And all these men are waiting in line. Notice there's no women here, probably because at that time in the 1930s, many women stayed home and the men were the ones that worked. So that's probably why you see more men in this line. This picture down here shows a family. You see how the children are dressed here, no shoes. Their clothes are tattered. Notice that this is their home in the background here. You see how it's just pieced together. Their clothes are on a clothesline back here, and there's like a little stove here. I will tell you that my dad grew up during this time. This could have been my dad right here. And one thing that he has always said is that they were poor, but everyone was poor, and so they didn't feel poor. They didn't realize how bad off they were because a lot of people were in that same situation. And my grandfather did lose his business. He owned his own business, and he did lose his business during the Great Depression. Some people that lived in these little neighborhoods that look like this, they were called shanty towns. You see these buildings that are pieced together. These became known as Hoovervilles. See these little houses over here? My dad and his family did not have to live like this. All right, they didn't have to live like this. So it was much worse for a lot of people than it was for my dad's family. If you didn't have any money in your pockets and you pulled your pockets out here, those were called Hoover flags. And newspapers that might be put over you to keep you warm at night instead of a blanket, newspapers became known as Hoover blankets. So you see here that President Hoover is definitely being blamed for the how bad it got. Well, it had been bad for the farmers for a long time. Farmers in the Great Plains area of the United States had been plowing up the plains area to grow crops for years. And during the 1930s, in addition to the Depression, the Great Depression, there was also a terrible drought, a long period without rain that hit this Great Plains region over here. And you can see here that Texas is part of it. This red part is where it was the worst. Okay, but all of this was affected by the drought. So this is known as the Great Plains area. It goes from Texas all the way up to North Dakota. All right, and the ground cover that had been holding the soil in place was gone due to the farming techniques. So when the winds began to blow down through here, this is the Great Plains area, the winds blow down through here because of the drought and the soil being so dry, it began to literally just blow away. The land began to blow away, and the wind blew for years. So down here you see a picture of a dust storm. All right, so here you see this dust storm. This is the ground literally being blown away by the winds that came down through the Great Plains area. All of this, everything here that you see in brown is considered a dust bowl state. So we were a dust bowl state. And then other areas that had damage are in yellow. And then the worst damage you see right up here in red. Here's some more pictures that show the dust bowl. These people just have stopped their cars along the side of the road here to watch this coming in. Okay, you can see it here behind these houses. A lot of farmers in that region began to leave and go west to California to look for work. A lot of them came from Oklahoma, and so they began to be called Okies. And so many of them left Oklahoma to go to California that it was like the Great Migration that we've talked about earlier. This was a mass migration of people whenever they were moving west to try to find work. A novel was written, a famous novel called The Grapes of Wrath, written by John Steinbeck, and he was telling the story of some of the Okies on their journey as they became migrant workers in California. This was also made into a movie. You may have heard of it. Dorothea Lane took pictures of the effect of the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression on American people. This is a famous picture of a woman, a mother in California. She had 7 children, and she was a farm worker. And you see this other family. You see how they've stopped, literally using their car here to help provide shelter, to help provide a home. A lot of Mexicans had come to the United States during the 1920s. If you look over here at this graph, you can see right here these are the 1920s through 1930s right here. A lot of Mexicans had come to the United States, but look what happens here to our graph. Well, why did that happen? It happened because the number of Mexican immigrants that was allowed in, that were allowed in during the Great Depression was reduced. Only 33,000 were allowed in during the 1930s, during that whole decade. And in the decade prior to that, there'd been 500,000. The reason for that was because jobs had become so hard to find, and white American farmers began to take jobs that had previously been filled by Mexican immigrants. So competition for work increased. So did prejudice and discrimination. In the 1930s, one of the things President Hoover did was sign this law, the Mexican Repatriation Act, and it forced 500,000 Mexican Americans to be repatriated or sent back to Mexico because of the competition for jobs. So that explains this graph. Again, talking about President Hoover, what did he do? Well, too little, too late. Remember that when we're looking at a political cartoon, this guy here is Uncle Sam. This represents the United States, and you can see it's been definitely impacted, right? It says the Hoover prosperity. President Hoover had come into office discussing and talking about prosperity for Americans, but it obviously didn't happen, did it? And you see this big cloud here, this black cloud is probably symbolic of the dust storms and the crash of the stock market and the whole economy just falling apart. But he did try to do some things. He cut taxes, created a federal agency to buy excess farm crops. He increased federal spending on public projects like the Hoover Dam. He established the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. It gave emergency loans to banks and businesses, but not people, not the public. His hope was that by giving money to banks and businesses that it would trickle down to the people. But again, this is too little, too late. Another thing that happened, summer of 1932. So remember, our stock market crash was 1929. So we're now 3 years into this. In the summer of 1932, more than 15,000 veterans from World War I came to Washington, D.C. They were owed a bonus for their military service, and they wanted the money sooner than they were originally supposed to get it. They needed it. You see the reasons why they needed it. They demanded an early payment of the bonuses, but Congress refused to pay. So if you look at this picture here, these people that are camped out here in front of the Capitol are veterans. These are people that risked their life in World War I. So that caused a big problem to have veterans camped out trying to get paid, trying to get what they were owed by the government, and the government being unwilling to help them. So there's another extreme result or extreme effect of the Depression. So that brings us up to 1932. The bonus army that I just explained about was the summer of 1932. In November, just a few months later, there's an election. And Americans were ready for a change. So the 1932 presidential election saw Franklin Delano Roosevelt, win, and he's going to win in a landslide. against Hoover. You can imagine that Americans were desperate for something different. We're going to see Franklin Roosevelt called FDR. So over the next few weeks, when you hear him being mentioned, FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, is who we're talking about. Remember, there was another President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. They are cousins, all right? They're distant cousins. So same family. President Roosevelt promised the American people a New Deal. He promised to change things. And this is a famous picture, a famous cartoon that shows him. And you see him in a lifeboat, and you probably know that someone that comes to you in a lifeboat is coming to save you, right? And if you look closely here, you see the person in the water has on the stars here. You see the stars and you see the little hat back here. So the person in the water is Uncle Sam, right? It's the United States. It's us. And they're drowning in the waters of the Depression. And here comes Franklin Roosevelt pledging something new, pledging to help. Now, sometimes when we've evaluated this cartoon, sometimes my students have thought that President Roosevelt was trying to push this person into the water, but it's actually the opposite. He is there to try to rescue. And so we will see in the next few days what happens when President Roosevelt comes to office and what he does to try to help the American people during the Great Depression.